The story of Archimedes Codex C sounds too sensational to be true. It's usually told something like this. In the early 13th century, the last existing copy of a collection of works by the mathematical genius Archimedes, containing a text describing calculus which could change history, is taken out of Constantinople just before the army of the Fourth Crusade invades. The imperial library is destroyed, and the city is left in ruins. Having narrowly survived annihilation, the priceless text travels to Jerusalem, most likely by sea, a journey of 11 days and 1,820 kilometers. Here, it finds its way to a small Christian church, where it is kept safe for 20 years. Then one day, a local scribe makes a fatal decision. In need of expensive parchment to write a prayer book, he decides to recycle several old books in the church library. Through carelessness or ignorance, one of the books he chooses is the collection of Archimedes. The scribe brutally scrapes the words off the pages with a razor, then sponges the pages with a weak acid to remove all remaining trace of the original text. Having done this, he cuts up the pages, combines them with leaves from other texts he has recycled, then writes over them to make his new prayer book. Archimedes' work disappears from the world, concealed within the binding of a common religious text with comparatively little value. Archimedes' breakthrough discovery of calculus, which could have put people on the moon by the 18th century, is lost to science. No trace of it remains anywhere on the planet, and its existence is completely forgotten. It would take another 400 years for early modern mathematicians to catch up to Archimedes and finally rediscover calculus. With various changes in detail, this is how the story is typically told. Often it's summarized tersely with a single sentence, something like, quote, "Ancient wisdom eradicated by a moron who believed in fairy tales," end quote. Or, quote, "Archimedes came up with calculus, but the church destroyed the only manuscript," end quote. It's a gripping tale, evoking visceral emotions such as burning outrage at the destruction of priceless knowledge and poignant regret at the loss of an alternative history. However, it's a tale which strays far from the facts, which are actually far more complex and intriguing. This is the first of two videos describing what really happened to Codex C. This video covers these topics. Firstly, Archimedes' work and impact. Secondly, the origin and transmission of Codex C. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the video content. Archimedes' work and impact. Of all the classical Greek thinkers, Archimedes of Syracuse has arguably been the most influential on human history. Even compared with the impact of Plato and Socrates on philosophy and politics, Hipparchus and Ptolemy on astronomy, and Aristotle on a dizzying array of scientific, mathematical, and metaphysical topics, the work of Archimedes stands alone, almost without peer. The primary reason for this is that, unlike the writings of these other thinkers, the work of Archimedes has proved astonishingly accurate, withstanding the acid test of time. As the modern scientific era emerged, most classical Greek theories on astronomy, medicine, biology, and other branches of science were found to be deeply flawed at best and completely useless at worst. However, the mathematics and physics of Archimedes not only endured the rigorous scrutiny of scholars such as Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, but was instrumental in the scientific revolution. Reviel Netz and William Noel, two scholars who worked extensively on Archimedes Codex C, have commented that the influence of Archimedes is so immense that the entire European scientific tradition, quote, "consists of a series of footnotes to Archimedes," end quote. Strangely, however, Archimedes' mathematical work was not widely known during the classical era. Although his works are cited by Hellenistic authors on math and physics, Archimedes' texts were not collected and used as university curriculum material unlike the writings of other Greek scholars. In fact, Archimedes was not fully appreciated until the Christian era, when, in the 6th century, Eutychius of Ascalon and Isidore of Miletus, a mathematician and architect of the immense Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople, wrote commentaries on his works for the benefit of their students. Historian of mathematics Wilbur Knorr cites Eutychius and Isidore as, quote, notable in the advancement of mathematical studies at Constantinople later in the 6th century, end quote. Historically, it has been thought that Isidore was responsible for compiling Archimedes' work systematically into a collection, or corpus. However, modern scholars are more cautious, concluding that Isidore may only have collected a few of them into one work. Netz writes, quote, it thus appears that a book collecting several treatises by Archimedes was prepared by Isidore of Miletus or his associates in Constantinople in the 6th century AD, end quote. The idea of Isidore making such a collection is suggested by Eutychius' commentary on Archimedes' treatise on the sphere and cylinder, which opens by describing itself as a commentary on the edition, quote, collated by the Milesian mechanical author Isidore our teacher, end quote. However, although this gives the appearance of Eutychius writing commentary on a collection of works compiled by Isidore, it is unlikely that this text was written by Eutychius himself. Historian Wilbur Knorr wrote that, quote, it has since been established that Eutychius well antedated Isidore. Thus, the comment on Isidore's commentary is not part of Eutychius' text, but has been interpolated into it by a disciple of Isidore, that is, about a generation after Eutychius, end quote. Regardless of who wrote this introduction, it is difficult to know what it means by collation, and even more challenging to know what this collation included. Netz himself notes, quote, it could be anything ranging from mere proofreading to a major re-edition, either of Eutychius' text or of Archimedes' text itself. Classical scholar Professor Alan Cameron has observed that neither Isidore nor Eutychius seem to have known many of Archimedes' works, writing, quote, Eutychius seems to have known only the 3 works of Archimedes on which he wrote commentaries, and Isidore perhaps only the first 2, end quote. Cameron grants that Isidore, quote, played a central role in the transmission of the text, end quote, but dismisses the idea that Isidore had a large collection of Archimedes' manuscripts from which to work. Thomas G. Chondros, assistant professor at the University of Patras, agrees with Cameron and Netz that, quote, a book collecting several treatises by Archimedes was prepared in the 6th century AD by Isidore of Miletus and Anathomius the Trallius, end quote. This collection of Archimedes was highly influential and was still being copied 3 centuries later. Chondros writes that in the 9th century it was copied, quote, by Leo the Geometer or his associates, once again in Constantinople, end quote. Netz explains that scholars now refer to this work as Codex A, and that it contains Archimedes' works on the sphere and cylinder, books 1 and 2, measurement of a circle, on conoids and spheroids, spiral lines, planes in equilibrium, books 1 and 2, the sand reckoner, quadrature of the parabola, and a commentary by Eutychius. In the 9th century, another collection, now called Codex B, was also written in Constantinople. Netz says this codex contained Archimedes' works Planes in Equilibrium, books 1 and 2, On Floating Bodies, books 1 and 2, and Quadrature of the Parabola. Netz also says that codices A and B, quote, had a very important role to play in the history of Western science, end quote. Near the end of the 10th century, a 3rd collection of Archimedes' works was written in Constantinople. This collection was the now famous Codex C, the convoluted history of which is the focus of this video. Netz says it was, quote, probably a copy of a late ancient book, end quote, and describes it as containing Archimedes' works Planes in Equilibrium, books 1 and 2, On Floating Bodies, books 1 and 2, Spiral Lines, On the Sphere and Cylinder, Measurement of the Circle, Stomachion, and, most importantly of all, Method of Mechanical Theorems. It is this last work, commonly known simply as the Method, which has become legendary in the history of mathematics. Origin and History of Codex C. Of all the collections of Archimedes' works, the Origin and History of Codex C is the most complex and difficult to trace. This codex has been of greatest interest to both mathematicians and historians due to the fact that it is the only Greek source of two of Archimedes' most discussed texts. One of these texts was the Stomachion, a description of a mathematical puzzle game intended to illustrate principles of mathematics and geometry. The other work was the Method of Mechanical Theorems, known commonly as simply the Method. This is the text which some commentators claim could have changed the history of the world. To fully understand the significance of Codex C and the Method of Mechanical Theorems, we must trace the history of the method. Sometime during the 3rd century BCE, just over 2,200 years ago, the mathematician Archimedes was living on the Isle of Syracuse in the Mediterranean Sea. Little is known of his life since the only contemporary biography has been lost, and the only available biographies were written hundreds of years later and consequently contain only fragmentary information. What we can be sure of is that Archimedes belonged to the intellectual and socio-economic elite. His father was an astronomer and the head of a wealthy family, so Archimedes would have enjoyed all the benefits of a privileged position in society, including financial independence, unencumbered leisure, the best available education, and, of course, slaves. Archimedes received his early education at the University of Alexandria, which was, at the time, the greatest center of knowledge and learning anywhere in the world. Please note that, yes, I am using the term university somewhat anachronistically, but it's a convenient term for an ancient center of learning which functioned on similar lines as our own. Professor Thomas G. Chondros tells us that Archimedes' teachers were Conon of Samos and Eratosthenes of Cyrene, two of the most famous mathematicians of the era. Conon had been the head of the famous Library of Alexandria, and Eratosthenes took over this position from Conon during the lifetime of Archimedes. Archimedes' instruction under Eratosthenes would become critical to the later history of Codex C, and in particular to its most important text, the Method. Given Archimedes' reputation, the large number of texts he wrote, and the significant breakthroughs and refinements he made in a range of mathematical fields, it may seem unusual that his work was not widely known or recognized in his own day, or even for centuries later. In fact, even the earliest biographies of him typically praise him as an engineer rather than as a mathematician, which is even more ironic given that they often attribute to him inventions and engineering achievements which he actually never made. Unlike the works of famous classical writers such as Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Ptolemy, Archimedes' mathematical texts did not inspire countless ancient commentaries and were not used as curriculum material in Greek universities. This appears counterintuitive given the obvious value of his writings and the immense progress he made in a range of mathematical fields. Why was Archimedes not more widely known and studied by his contemporaries, nor even by Greek scholars of the next few centuries? The answer is that, unlike other Greek scholars such as Aristotle and Pythagoras, Archimedes did not produce his works as a teacher at a university or private school. If he had, many more copies of his works would have been made, and commentaries on them would have been written by his fellow mathematicians, as well as by teachers explaining them to their students. Instead, Chondros writes, quote, Archimedes published his works in the form of correspondence with the principal mathematicians of his time, end quote. This also explains why the earliest collections of Archimedes' works do not appear until centuries after his death. His texts simply weren't widely available because they were mainly personal letters to individuals who had no motivation to copy them and distribute them further around the ancient world. Unfortunately for history and for his fellow mathematicians, this habit of Archimedes completely inhibited the broader impact and study of his discoveries and achievements. It also didn't help that when Archimedes wrote these letters, he wasn't even always honest, and sometimes his letters contained clever traps for the unwary. At times, Archimedes would write a letter to someone making a particular mathematical claim, but without including the proof, that is, the explanation of how the claim is supported mathematically. A careful reader would investigate the claim and test it to see if this was actually possible. A careless reader, in particular a mathematician hoping to make a name for themselves, would write to Archimedes and other people simply asserting that they had solved one of Archimedes' puzzles and discovered the proof of the claim without actually showing how they achieved this. Then Archimedes would answer triumphantly that his initial claim was totally false, and he would produce mathematical evidence demonstrating it could not be true. Netz tells us that one example of this is in a letter Archimedes sent to a colleague called Dositheus, in which he described certain alleged mathematical discoveries and invited other people to find proofs for them. However, in a later letter, Archimedes tells Dositheus that no one had answered with a proof, and explains that the reason for this is that two of the alleged discoveries were completely fictitious. He had simply made them up. This may seem like strange behavior for a mathematician, but it was just standard practice for Archimedes. He was acutely aware of his own skill and obviously took delight in teasing other scholars. Why did he do this? We really don't know. This was highly idiosyncratic behavior and very likely contributed to Archimedes' widespread reputation as an eccentric. We could guess that being an intellectual giant living on the tiny island of Syracuse, a remote Greek colony without any great center of learning and known for absolutely nothing, Archimedes was simply starved for intelligent company at his own level. Now, that is, of course, simply a guess, but in light of his behavior, it's not an unreasonable conclusion. What we do know is that this is certainly one way he passed his time. Netz says Archimedes, quote, really did send out poisoned letters, hoping to trap his fellow mathematicians, end quote, with the aim of showing up scholars who were less skillful than himself and exposing their fraudulent claims. So the text of Archimedes, which contained the legendary method, was not an academic treatise. In fact, originally it didn't even have a title. It was a personal letter to Eratosthenes, head of the famous Library of Alexandria in Egypt, 11 days and 1,800 kilometers away from Syracuse by sea. In this letter, Archimedes mentions that he had previously sent Eratosthenes some mathematical theorems, inviting him to figure out the proofs for himself. He also says that since he respects Eratosthenes as an earnest student, important philosopher, and admirer of mathematics, he has decided to describe a certain mathematical method which Eratosthenes could use to solve certain problems. Archimedes writes, quote, seeing, moreover, in you, as I say, an earnest student, a man of considerable eminence in philosophy, and an admirer, that is, of mathematical inquiry, I thought fit to write out for you and explain in detail in the same book the peculiarity of a certain method by which it will be possible for you to get a start to enable you to investigate some of the problems in mathematics by means of mechanics, end quote. This letter is remarkable for the respect Archimedes shows to Eratosthenes, as well as for the fact that it is entirely genuine in its intentions. It doesn't contain any of the mathematical traps of his other correspondence. Instead, Archimedes voluntarily describes one of his most fascinating and significant discoveries. This makes sense when we remember that Archimedes himself had been taught by Eratosthenes while receiving his education in Alexandria. So Archimedes was writing to his former tutor, whom he both remembered and respected, and it probably gave him some delight to send challenging mathematical puzzles to the man who had been his teacher. Note that he does refer to Eratosthenes as a student, which is a bit tongue-in-cheek. Historian of science Professor Lieber Taub writes that Archimedes also corresponded with his other tutors, Conon and Dositheus, though he seems to have reserved his greatest respect for Eratosthenes. Netz and Noel provide another motivation for Archimedes' correspondence with Eratosthenes, writing that although Eratosthenes was a polymath known for his immense knowledge of a wide range of subjects, he was also, quote, nicknamed Beta because he was the number 2 on everything, end quote. They add, quote, Archimedes, who clearly saw himself as number one in his field, approached Eratosthenes with great apparent respect, but he almost seems to be teasing him. End quote. So by sending his most serious and complex mathematical work to Eratosthenes, Archimedes was not only demonstrating his respect for his former tutor, suggesting that such work was worthy only of a man of Eratosthenes' intelligence, but also demonstrating his own personal brilliance, suggesting that there was no one else who would understand him. Although Eratosthenes would certainly have read the letter, we have no record of any reply. Likewise, we do not know what Eratosthenes did with the letter after reading it, although it seems he didn't distribute it further. It is possible that he used it as curriculum material when teaching mathematics in Alexandria, but if this had happened, then there would most likely be evidence in the form of scholarly commentaries on the text, written by lecturers helping their students to understand it. Given the lack of any ancient commentaries, and given the lack of any reference to this specific text by either Archimedes' mathematical contemporaries or by Eratosthenes' students and scholarly successors, it seems likely that Eratosthenes treated it more like personal correspondence than curriculum material. However, there is evidence that Eratosthenes considered the contents to be so important that he had the letter copied and filed in the Great Library of Alexandria itself. If this is true, then the letter had an astonishing number of escapes from annihilation. Just 200 years after Eratosthenes received the letter, a fire caused by the soldiers of Roman dictator Julius Caesar destroyed some 40,000 scrolls belonging to the Library of Alexandria, according to the Roman historian Titus Livius, who was born shortly after the event. But Archimedes' letter, whether the original or a copy, managed to survive. After this time, the Library of Alexandria fell into terminal decline, losing its funding, prestige, and academic standing. From the fact that smaller libraries soon emerged in the city, we may infer that the original Great Library's collection had become broken up and distributed between these other institutions, which were cheaper to staff and maintain. Somehow, Archimedes' letter also survived the library's loss of fortune, and about 500 years later, it was found in 6th century Constantinople, at least 700 years after Archimedes wrote it, and 1,500 kilometers away from Alexandria. How did this happen? It might seem incredible that someone would consider it important to transport this single letter 1,500 kilometers from Egypt to Constantinople, but it's very doubtful that's what actually happened. Although we can't be certain, there are a few historical facts which help us trace the letter's journey with very reasonable reliability. Alexandria's status in the ancient world continued to decline, and it was the victim of a number of disasters in the centuries after Julius Caesar. Netz and Knoll tell us that during a war in 270 of the Christian era, the Roman Emperor Aurelian, quote, damaged a large portion of the palace complex which contained the museum, end quote. This was the study center where Archimedes himself had learned mathematics. They also tell us that in 391, quote, Theophilus, the Archbishop of Alexandria, destroyed the Serapeum, the sister library of the museum, end quote. But by this time, Alexandria's fortunes had fallen so low that the Serapeum was actually no longer a library. Instead, it was a place of worship for pagans. So by the end of the 4th century, Alexandria's most important intellectual centers had been all but ruined, and the fate of their original contents was highly uncertain. It was clear from these events that the literary heritage of the classical age was already in serious danger. Fortunately, at this time, steps were soon taken to help preserve it. Netz and Knoll describe how the pagan philosopher Themistius spoke to the Christian Roman Emperor Constantius in Constantinople, urging him to build a scriptorium, a center for the collection and copying of classical literature. Netz and Knoll also write that, quote, in 372 AD, an order was issued to the city prefect, Clearchus, to appoint 4 scribes skilled in Greek and 3 in Latin to undertake the transcription and repair of books, end quote. They add that in 425, the Christian Emperor Theodosius II, quote, established an imperial foundation for literary and philosophical studies, end quote. So Constantinople became a haven for the Greek and Latin literature of the classical age, which was carefully collected, copied, and preserved behind the city's great stone walls. This project was just in time as the barbarian invasions of Rome began in the 5th century, with the capital itself burned by the Visigoths in 410. In 476, Rome fell for the last time, and the Western Roman Empire disintegrated into fragments. From this point, the Scriptorium of Constantinople became the most important collection of mathematical literature in the world, and somewhere among its countless texts lay the letter of Archimedes to Eratosthenes, containing the peculiar method which has fascinated historians of math for over a century. But how did this letter travel from Alexandria to Constantinople? The task of tracing the letter's history is made particularly difficult by the fact that almost no one in antiquity seems to have known it even existed. Although some of Archimedes' other works were known and commented on by Greek mathematicians such as Apollonius of Perga and Eutychius of Ascalon, no commentaries were made on this letter. Eratosthenes himself apparently did not write a commentary on it, and it seems no one else did either. The fact that there aren't any ancient commentaries on this letter is not by itself unusual. As mentioned previously, this is true of most of Archimedes' works, which Netz and Knowles say were, quote, hardly ever read, end quote. They comment that although some of Archimedes' theorems and findings became popular, quote, few people actually read his arguments. They were simply too difficult, end quote. However, even though few scholars of the ancient world had the ability to comprehend and explain Archimedes' work, we do have several commentaries on a number of his other texts. In contrast, his letter to Eratosthenes is almost invisible in the historical record. After its first arrival in Alexandria, there is no mention of it for literally centuries. In fact, it isn't even mentioned in any extant sources until the 9th century. This makes it even more difficult to determine how it survived in Alexandria at all, and even more importantly, how it finally arrived in Constantinople. Nevertheless, there is a thin thread of historical evidence from which a plausible chronology can be woven. Earlier in this video, it was noted that in Alexandria, Archimedes' works had been studied by Eutychius of Ascalon, who wrote commentaries on Archimedes on the sphere and cylinder, books 1 and 2, on the measurement of the circle, and on the equilibrium of planes. It was also noted that the first academic collection of Archimedes' works was made by the 6th century mathematician and architect Isidore of Miletus. Although he is most famous for designing the Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople, it is much less known that he did not originally live in that city. In fact, he originally lived in Alexandria, where he taught physics and Euclidean geometry at a local university, and also wrote commentaries on Archimedes' works. Although there is no way to be certain, it seems very likely that Isidore's university had access to, and may even have owned, a large collection of mathematical texts which had originally been kept by the Great Library of Alexandria, that Archimedes' mathematical writings were among those works, and that one of those mathematical writings was the letter to Eratosthenes. It also seems very likely that when Isidore finally left Alexandria and moved to Constantinople, he collected all the works of Archimedes he could find, and that the letter to Eratosthenes was among them. The main reason for this conclusion is the fact that significant collections of Archimedes' work appear in Constantinople shortly after Isidore arrived there. Isidore himself worked with Anthemius of Tralles to put together a small compilation of some of Archimedes' treatises. Around the same time, another collection of Archimedes' works was made in Constantinople. Between the two of them, these two codices, Codex A and Codex B, contained 8 of Archimedes' 10 works. This was an unprecedented achievement. Never before had so many of Archimedes' treatises been gathered together in just 2 volumes. This could only have been made possible by access to most of Archimedes' texts, if not to all of them, and is easily understood if Isidore himself had brought such a collection from Alexandria to Constantinople. So by the 6th century, Constantinople had copies of Archimedes' works on the sphere and cylinder, books 1 and 2, measurement of a circle, on conoids and spheroids, spiral lines, the sand reckoner, quadrature of the parabola, on the equilibrium of planes, books 1 and 2, and on floating bodies, books 1 and 2. However, where are the other two texts, the Method of Mechanical Theorems contained in the letter to Eratosthenes, and the Ostomachion? Here we enter the realm of historical hypothesis, but we do so on the basis of some firm evidence. It seems more likely that these two texts were among the others brought by Isidore from Alexandria to Constantinople, but that they were not prioritized for copying and studying at this time, and thus they were not included in the two initial collections of Codex A and Codex B. There are a number of facts supporting this conclusion. The first is that Isidore himself was an architect and looked on mathematics as a practical discipline. As one of the lead architects of the famous Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople, he was mainly concerned with using Archimedes' geometry as the basis for his architectural designs. He was less interested in theoretical mathematics and the kind of puzzles for which Archimedes was famous. The Ostomachion was a text describing a puzzle which challenges the reader to assemble 14 geometric shapes into a square in as many different configurations as possible. Although this is a useful illustration of certain geometric principles, it doesn't have the same practical utility as Archimedes' other work, and is essentially a mathematical game. Consequently, it may not have been seen as an academically important work. As for the Method of Mechanical Theorems, its practical application to real-world problem-solving was not even obvious to Archimedes, who described it only as a means to investigate mathematical problems. Consequently, it is very possible that the Ostomachion and the Method of Mechanical Theorems were not considered sufficiently practical to make them a priority for copying, collection, and study. Another fact supporting this conclusion is that around 300 years later, also in Constantinople, both the Ostomachion and the letter to Eratosthenes, which contained the Method of Mechanical Theorems, were copied and compiled with other works of Archimedes into a third book, which is now called Codex C. The fact that 8 of Archimedes' 10 works were compiled in Constantinople in the 6th century, and that the other 2 were compiled in Constantinople a few centuries later, is substantial corroborating evidence that the entire collection was already in Constantinople by the 6th century. If we assume that only 8 works were available in 6th century Constantinople, it becomes necessary to propose how the other 2 arrived there between the 6th and the 9th centuries. This is therefore a solution which only creates another problem, and is consequently less likely than the proposal that all 10 of Archimedes' works had already arrived in Constantinople by the 6th century. The fact that Isidore studied Archimedes in Alexandria and then moved to Constantinople, where he not only used Archimedes' mathematics in his architectural work, but also wrote commentaries on some of Archimedes' works, provides a much more efficient explanation of how the letter to Eratosthenes found its way from Alexandria to Constantinople. Regardless of the fine details, we know for certain that a copy of Archimedes' letter survived the turmoil in Alexandria and eventually arrived in Constantinople somewhere around the 6th century. We also know that some time later it was copied by a professional scribe. From this point, the letter's chances of long-term survival increased dramatically. Archimedes wrote his original letter on papyrus, a thin, cheap paper made from reeds, which was used all throughout the ancient Near East. In Alexandria, the letter would have been copied onto the same material, since papyrus reeds had already been the source of Egyptian paper for thousands of years. In the Byzantine Empire, the preferred medium for writing texts was not papyrus, but parchment, very thin sheets of leather peeled from the inside of an animal's hide. Parchment was thicker than papyrus, so it took up more room even when folded or rolled up, and it was much more time-consuming and costly to make. However, unlike papyrus, which was suitable for the hot and dry climate of the ancient Near East, but disintegrated quickly in wetter environments, parchment was much more suitable for the damper and colder environment of Europe. Since it was leather, parchment was incredibly strong and could survive for a couple of centuries under conditions in which papyrus would quickly fall to pieces. Unlike papyrus, it could also be repaired by sewing if it was torn. Archimedes' works were kept safely in Constantinople, where they were read, studied, and copied again. As we have seen previously, in the 10th century, 3 important collections of Archimedes' work were made: Codex A, Codex B, and Codex C. Between them, these 3 books contained all of Archimedes' available treatises. After the fall of Constantinople to the Fourth Crusade in 1204, these 3 10th century collections of Archimedes' work were scattered across the world. We do not know how they managed to escape the fires which destroyed much of Constantinople and its libraries, but whoever rescued them must have known their worth. Curiously, Codices A and B were taken to the west, while Codex C was taken to the east. We don't know who took them or why they ended up going in different directions, but in the chaos of the fall of Constantinople, it is very likely that there was no coordinated rescue effort. It is more probable that a few far-sighted members of the economic elite and the scholarly classes simply gathered up as many texts as they could carry and left the city while it was still possible. What we do know is that certain people realized that the siege of Constantinople represented a serious threat to a priceless intellectual heritage and took deliberate steps to preserve it. This demonstrates just how aware they were of the value and potential impact of this unique body of knowledge. Netz describes how Codices A and B, quote, soon made their way to Europe and by 1269 were in the papal library, end quote. It was here that they were found by the incredible 13th century scholar William of Moerbeker, who had dedicated himself to translating into Latin all the Greek classical works he could find for the benefit of Western scholars. Netz says William used Codices A and B, quote, for his own choice of collected works by Archimedes, translated into Latin, end quote. Marshall Claggett, professor of the history of science at Princeton, New Jersey, notes that as a result of William's painstaking work, quote, in this manuscript, then, Latin mathematicians at one stroke had all of the extant works of Archimedes and the commentaries by Eutychius, end quote, with the exception of only 3 genuine works by Archimedes and 1 of Eutychius' commentaries. The translation of Codices A and B by William was critical to the future development of mathematics in Western Europe. Thanks to William's dedication, Codices A and B survived in Latin long after the original Greek editions were lost. Netz says that the Greek manuscript of Codex A, quote, could have been lost as early as the 14th century, end quote, and that Codex A's Greek manuscript, quote, certainly disappeared toward the end of the 16th century, end quote. That leaves us with the history of Codex C, the unique collection of Archimedes' works in Greek, which contained what was possibly the only surviving copy of his most hotly discussed work, the Method of Mechanical Theorems, the text which some commentators claim could have changed the world. Of the works of Archimedes contained in Codex C, 4 are still extant in Greek copies. On Floating Bodies is no longer extant in Greek, but is still extant in Latin, and the Ostomachion is no longer extant in Greek or Latin, but is extant in an abridged form in Arabic. However, the last work, Method of Mechanical Theorems, is the most significant since up to the 19th century discovery of the Archimedes Palimpsest, it was no longer extant in any language. It was this text that found itself recycled to make a Christian prayer book in the 13th century. In the next video, we will look at exactly why it was recycled.